Michael Corleone stands inside a cathedral, swearing to reject Satan while simultaneously orchestrating the mass execution of his rivals. This baptism sequence is a clinical display of cognitive dissonance and marks the exact moment he replaces his humanity with sociopathic pragmatism. To the outside world, Michael projects the image of a legitimate American industrialist. Behind closed doors, severe paranoia dictates his every move. He rationalizes the systematic elimination of his enemies as basic preservation, building an impenetrable fortress of denial. The public sees an untouchable sovereign. The reality is an isolated man entirely consumed by his own ruthless mechanics of control. His origin is defined by an acute awareness of his bloodline's toxicity. He initially viewed his father's syndicate as a societal cancer fundamentally incompatible with the modern world. Enlisting in the military and attending Dartmouth were deliberate acts of surgical detachment from his heritage. He sought a legitimate existence, building a psychological firewall against the criminal realities surrounding his family. The sartorial choices at the opening wedding sequence serve as a deliberate psychological barricade. He wears an earth-tone military uniform, a jarring contrast to the tailored tuxedos of his bloodline. He weaponizes his military service to construct an identity completely divorced from his father's syndicate. He requires the external validation of the United States government to prove his inherent superiority over his own family. He physically distances himself from the dark interior of the Don's office, preferring the bright, oblivious exterior of the party. Kay Adams functions purely as a mirror reflecting his desired self-image. She is the physical embodiment of WASP legitimacy, completely ignorant of the subterranean violence funding her environment. She remains close not as a profound partner, but as a vital psychological anchor to maintain his carefully constructed compartmentalization. When he recounts the Luca Brasi anecdote, his tone is strictly anthropological. He speaks of his family's brutal coercion as if it were ancient history, actively deceiving both Kay and himself. The illusion of his autonomy shatters the moment his father is targeted. The attempted elimination of Vito Corleone exposes the fragility of his civilian facade. He discovers that the legitimate world he idolizes offers zero sanctuary for his bloodline. The systemic corruption of the institutions he trusted forces a radical recalibration of his worldview. His detachment transforms into a visceral territorial anxiety, fueled by a fragile male ego demanding action. His arrival at the unguarded hospital marks the definitive collapse of his self-deception. The empty corridors represent the failure of the established power structure to protect his patriarch. He experiences a chilling cognitive clarity in the face of imminent danger. There is no panic, only the sudden terrifying activation of latent tactical instincts. He begins to micromanage his father's preservation, stepping seamlessly into the role of a sovereign. The physical manipulation of his father's bed is a critical psychological threshold. He is no longer the detached college student. He is the active architect of his family's survival. The interaction with Enzo the baker highlights this rapid evolution. Enzo is paralyzed by fear, yet he remains entirely composed under the threat of impending violence. He mimics the posture of an armed enforcer, discovering a dark comfort in the projection of lethal authority. The arrival of Captain McCluskey introduces a brutal reality check to his intellectual arrogance. McCluskey represents the absolute corruption of the legitimate authority he previously revered. The physical blow to his face shatters more than just his jaw. It is a profound insult to his fragile male ego, an unforgivable trampling of his inherent pride. The physical pain becomes the catalyst for his moral decay. He returns to the family compound physically altered and psychologically rewired. The bruised, wired jaw serves as a constant, agonizing reminder of his vulnerability in the civilian world. He observes his older brother Sonny's erratic emotional mismanagement of the crisis. Sonny's volatile rage is tactically useless, reinforcing his belief in his own intellectual superiority. He recognizes that the syndicate requires cold, clinical precision, not hot-blooded vendettas. The family council scene is the autopsy of his innocence. He sits quietly, observing the chaotic and ineffective brainstorming of seasoned syndicate members. When he finally speaks, proposing the elimination of Sollozzo and McCluskey, he disrupts the entire operational paradigm. The room erupts in dismissive laughter, viewing his proposition as the naive fantasy of a college boy. This dismissal further inflames his ego, demanding immediate vindication. Rather than arguing from a place of emotional retribution, he constructs a flawless utilitarian rationalization for the impending strike. McCluskey is reframed, stripped of his shielded authority and presented merely as a corrupt, disposable asset. He weaponizes his Ivy League vocabulary to sanitize a brutal underworld execution. He convinces his family that this is a necessary strategic excision, a temporary evil to ensure long-term preservation. His psychological framing of the act relies entirely on self-deception. He convinces himself that because his motives are defensive, his soul remains untarnished. He views the impending violence as an isolated transaction, a necessary toll to cross back into legitimacy. He is entirely blind to the reality that crossing this specific moral boundary is irreversible. The rationalization is complete. The outsider has willingly stepped into the abyss. The preparation for the meeting reveals a disturbing lack of hesitation. Clemenza's tutorial on close-range lethal mechanics is absorbed with chilling academic interest. He does not flinch at the graphic description of the biological aftermath. He treats the firearm not as an instrument of horror, but as a necessary surgical tool. This profound psychological detachment allows him to cleanly sever the physical act from its inevitable moral consequence. The dinner at the Bronx restaurant is a masterpiece of suffocating tension. Sollozzo attempts to negotiate in Italian, appealing to a shared cultural and professional understanding. His facial expressions remain locked, processing the dialogue through a strictly analytical filter. He recognizes that Sollozzo is merely buying time, viewing the negotiation as a hollow preamble to further aggression. His internal decision is finalized long before he retrieves the hidden weapon. The moment of execution is devoid of cinematic triumph. The noise of the passing train covers the auditory reality of the violence, mirroring his internal suppression of guilt. He eliminates both targets with a mechanical, emotionless efficiency. Dropping the weapon is supposed to be the end of the transaction, the closing of a temporary, dark chapter. Instead, it is the definitive cementing of his new identity. His immediate exile to Sicily is physically distant but psychologically isolating. He is removed from the immediate consequences of his actions, allowing the rationalization to solidify. The rustic environment of Corleone serves as a stark contrast to the modern complexities of New York, yet he carries the psychological contagion of his violence with him. He is a man existing in purgatory, waiting for the fallout of his transition. The courtship of Apollonia is a temporary, desperate regression into a fantasy of innocence. She represents a pure, untainted existence, entirely disconnected from the moral decay of his reality. He pursues her with an archaic traditional rigidity, seeking a sanitized version of patriarchal control. His affection is genuine, but it is deeply rooted in his need for a blank slate. He uses her as a psychological anchor to a life he can never actually possess. The car explosion that claims Apollonia is the final devastating collapse of his legitimate aspirations. It is the brutal realization that collateral damage is unavoidable in the ecosystem he chose to enter. The violence he initiated in New York has directly incinerated his temporary sanctuary in Sicily. His grief is immediate, but it is quickly consumed by a profound, agonizing paranoia. The illusion that he could control the parameters of the underworld is permanently shattered. He returns to America utterly devoid of his previous ideological constraints. The civilian uniform is permanently discarded, replaced by the dark, tailored suits of his inheritance. His posture is rigid, his eyes are lifeless, and his vocabulary is stripped of any optimistic nuance. He no longer seeks to escape the syndicate. He intends to dominate it. The outsider has been completely consumed by the very cancer he once sought to excise. His reunion with Kay is a masterclass in emotional manipulation and emotional vacancy. He does not return to her out of love, but out of a rigid requirement for a traditional facade. He needs a legitimate partner to complete the optical illusion of his impending corporate transition. When he promises her that the family business will be completely legitimate in 5 years, it is a calculated lie. It is the ultimate manifestation of his self-deception, spoken by a man who has already surrendered his soul. He assumes control of the family empire with a terrifying absolute authority. He marginalizes the old guard, viewing their traditional methods as sentimental weaknesses. His father's advisory role is reduced to a ceremonial figurehead, respected but structurally bypassed. He isolates his brother Fredo, recognizing his fragility not as a tragedy to be managed, but as a liability to be contained. The architecture of his existential isolation is rapidly being constructed. He initiates the relocation to Nevada, moving the operation from the ethnic enclaves of New York to the sterile environment of corporate casinos. This geographical shift is a physical manifestation of his desire for sanitized power. He intends to launder his violence through legal gambling, hiding his tyranny behind balance sheets and state licenses. He believes that institutional wealth can permanently scrub the blood from his family's legacy. This is the zenith of his hubris. The conflict with Mo Green exposes the ruthlessness of his new operational standard. Diplomacy is replaced by dictations, delivered with cold, unwavering finality. Green's attempt to leverage historical ties is met with an instant, clinical shutdown of any emotional appeal. He views loyalty strictly through the lens of current utility. Anyone who resists his modernization is immediately categorized as an obstacle slated for elimination. He is rapidly constructing a psychological fortress that cannot be penetrated by familial warmth or moral hesitation. Every decision is weighed on a scale of absolute power and risk mitigation. He views himself as the tragic, necessary savior of the Corleone bloodline, bearing the cross of their historical sins. This martyr complex allows him to justify acts of increasing cruelty. He believes his emotional death is the required sacrifice for their survival. His interactions with his subordinates become entirely transactional. He demands absolute obedience, penalizing any display of independent thought or emotional hesitation. The warmth that characterized his father's inner circle is replaced by a suffocating paranoid tension. He trusts no one, constantly scanning his environment for microscopic signs of betrayal. He is the undisputed sovereign of his empire, yet he is the most imprisoned man within it. He manipulates the legal system with the same clinical detachment he applies to underworld rivalries. He purchases political influence and judicial favors, viewing the American justice system merely as another syndicate to be managed. He exposes the hypocrisy of the legitimate world he once idolized, utilizing its corruption to fortify his own position. His understanding of power has become completely cynical and entirely devoid of ethical constraints. He's a master of the very system he once believed he was above. The dynamic between him and the aging Vito during this transitional phase is a study in generational trauma. He observes his father's declining physical state, not with profound sorrow, but with a terrifying pragmatic calculation. He recognizes that the old man's era of relationship-based dominance is obsolete in the modern corporate underworld. He absorbs his father's strategic wisdom while actively discarding his capacity for mercy. He is stripping the humanity from the blueprint, leaving only the mechanics of control. The garden conversation before Vito's demise is the final transfer of absolute authority. The father expresses regret that his son was forced into this life, a sentiment he meets with chilling stoicism. He does not offer comfort. He simply confirms that the transition is complete and secure. He has already rationalized his descent, viewing his father's guilt as a useless sentimental artifact. The emotional disconnect between them is absolute, bridged only by their shared tactical paranoia. He anticipates the inevitable betrayal within his ranks with the cold precision of an actuary. Tessio's treason provokes no anger. It is simply processed as a confirmed variable within his vast operational equation. He allows the betrayal to materialize perfectly, using it to justify his impending sweeping retaliation. He is actively curating his own paranoia, validating his complete distrust of everyone around him. The isolation is no longer a byproduct of his lifestyle. It is a vital defensive mechanism. He approaches his role as a godfather to his sister's child with absolute terrifying hypocrisy. Standing at the altar, he explicitly renounces Satan and all his works in front of the congregation. Simultaneously, his orchestrated symphony of violence dismantles every rival syndicate across the city. This is the absolute peak of his cognitive dissonance. He uses the sacred ritual of baptism to provide an ironclad alibi for a mass execution. The synchronization of the religious ceremony with the tactical eliminations is not merely cinematic, it is deeply psychological. He views himself as a divine instrument of necessary retribution, cleansing his empire through blood. The holy water and the gunfire are conceptually identical in his fractured psyche. Both are necessary rituals for the purification and preservation of the Corleone legacy. He has completely conflated absolute evil with existential salvation. His confrontation with Carlo Rizzi following the baptism exposes the depths of his emotional manipulation. He initially offers a false sense of security, mimicking the merciful facade of his predecessor. He weaponizes Carlo's cowardice, coercing a confession through the illusion of exile rather than the threat of violence. The moment the confession is secured, the facade evaporates instantly. His promise of safety was merely an investigative tool, discarded the second it fulfilled its purpose. The elimination of Carlo is carried out with a bureaucratic efficiency that underscores his moral decay. He does not witness the act himself. He delegates the violence, maintaining his physical detachment from the consequences. He remains in the house, allowing the brutality to occur just outside his immediate perception. This spatial separation is crucial to his ongoing self-deception. He believes that by not pulling the trigger, his hands remain somewhat clean. Connie's subsequent hysterical accusation is an intrusion of raw, uncontrolled emotion into his sterile environment. She hurls the truth of his monstrous nature directly at him, shattering the quiet authority of his office. He does not flinch, nor does he offer a genuine defense against her accusations. He merely restrains her with a physical coldness, viewing her grief as an embarrassing loss of composure. He is entirely insulated from her agony, completely incapable of basic human empathy. Kay's demand for the truth forces him into the ultimate corner of his rationalization. He allows her to ask one single question about his business, a dangerous concession to his own manufactured reality. When he delivers the categorical denial regarding Carlo's demise, he crosses an uncrossable threshold. He looks directly into the eyes of his supposed moral anchor and lies without a microscopic trace of hesitation. The lie is so absolute, so devoid of tell, that it momentarily overrides her own intuition. The final image of the door closing on Kay is the physical sealing of his psychological tomb. The men step forward to kiss his hand, establishing the new, terrifying hierarchy. He accepts their fealty with an empty gaze, a sovereign trapped entirely within his own machinations. The transition is absolute. The former outsider has been subsumed by a ruthless sovereign, perfectly calibrated to govern an empire forged from ruin. His marginalization of Tom Hagen reveals his systematic dismantling of emotional loyalty. Hagen is an adopted brother, legally trained and deeply devoted to the family's survival. However, he views Hagen's inherent decency and lack of wartime experience as terminal liabilities. He dismisses Hagen as the primary advisor, framing it as a strategic necessity rather than a personal rejection. He cannot afford an advisor who still possesses a functional moral compass. He replaces Hagen's counsel with his own absolute, unquestioned judgment. He actively surrounds himself with executioners rather than strategists, prioritizing lethal efficiency over diplomatic nuance. This shift indicates a profound degradation in the syndicate's operational philosophy. He is transitioning the family from a complex political organization into a blunt, autocratic dictatorship. He demands soldiers who do not question the ethical implications of their orders. His embrace of Sicilian stoicism is entirely performative, a defense mechanism to mask his internal paranoia. True stoicism involves emotional regulation and resilience in the face of adversity. His version is a terrifying emotional necrosis, a deliberate deadening of his own nervous system. He uses silence not as a tool for contemplation, but as a weapon to intimidate and destabilize those around him. He projects an aura of absolute certainty to conceal the chaotic fragility of his ego. He fundamentally misunderstands the concept of respect, confusing it with paralyzing fear. His father cultivated a network of favors and obligations, building a community that actively wanted to support him. He dismantles this community, replacing it with a rigid structure of surveillance and immediate, brutal consequences for dissent. He believes that fear is a more reliable metric for control than affection. This fundamental miscalculation guarantees his eventual total isolation. His integration into the American corporate landscape is a grotesque parody of the American dream. He adopts the lexicon of boardrooms and mergers, utilizing legal loopholes and offshore accounts to expand his territory. He views legitimate businessmen not as peers, but as naive targets to be exploited by his superior ruthlessness. He proves that the only difference between a corporate raider and a syndicate boss is the mechanism of their violence. He brings the brutality of the streets into the executive suite. He views his wealth not as a tool for comfort, but as an endless resource for fortification. The sprawling compound is designed as a military installation, complete with perimeter security and armed patrols. He is constantly anticipating an attack, living in a state of perpetual hyper-vigilant anxiety. The luxury of his surroundings stands in jarring contrast to the austere, joyless reality of his daily existence. He has purchased an impenetrable cage. His relationship with his children is entirely devoid of paternal warmth or genuine engagement. He views them primarily as heirs, vital components for the continuation of his dynasty. He attempts to insulate them from his reality, perpetuating the same toxic cycle of deception his father utilized. He demands their respect and obedience, but remains completely inaccessible to their emotional needs. He is a ghost in his own home, present only as a looming authoritarian shadow. The generational trauma he swore to cure has only been amplified and modernized under his rule. He recognized the disease in his youth, but lacked the fundamental character to actually amputate it. Instead, he simply suppressed the symptoms with greater violence and sophisticated legal structures. He is the ultimate victim of his own hubris. A man who destroyed his soul to save a family he eventually alienated entirely. The tragedy of his existence is absolute and irreversible. He is trapped in an endless cycle of preemptive defensive actions. Every alliance is temporary, and every associate is a potential threat requiring eventual elimination. The rationalization that began in the Bronx restaurant has metastasized into a permanent operational doctrine. He can no longer distinguish between genuine survival and paranoid aggression. He will spend the rest of his life executing his demons, completely unaware that he is the primary source of the terror. The Lake Tahoe compound is meticulously designed to project an aura of WASP assimilation, yet it functions strictly as a high-security penal colony. He operates entirely in the shadows of his own home, physically separated from the sunny, legitimate celebrations occurring on his sprawling lawn. The communion party is a grand optical illusion, a theatrical performance of civilian normalcy, masking the ruthless syndicate operating behind closed doors. He receives guests not as a gracious host, but as an entrenched sovereign demanding tribute and reinforcing absolute subservience. The geographical shift to Nevada was supposed to represent a legitimate evolution, but it merely isolated his paranoia within a sterile, heavily fortified environment. His interaction with Senator Geary perfectly encapsulates his cynical mastery of institutional corruption. He does not react emotionally to the politician's overt bigotry or arrogant extortion attempts. Instead, he clinically analyzes the structural hypocrisy of the American government, recognizing Geary as a flawed asset to be compromised and weaponized. The subsequent blackmail operation involving the deceased sex worker is a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He completely breaks a sitting United States senator, turning a hostile adversary into a terrified, obedient puppet without personally firing a single weapon. Frank Pentangeli represents the archaic emotional legacy of the New York streets that he is actively attempting to erase. He views Pentangeli's territorial grievances as operational noise, completely dismissing the generational loyalty the old man desperately expects. His refusal to back Pentangeli against the Rosado brothers is a calculated, ice-cold strategic maneuver. He is entirely willing to sacrifice loyal street captains to maintain his fragile, high-level corporate alliance with Hyman Roth. This prioritization of sterile corporate strategy over blood loyalty accelerates the fracture of his own structural foundation. The orchestrated breach within his own bedroom marks the catastrophic collapse of his manufactured security perimeter. The shattered glass raining down on his bed is a visceral manifestation of his failed attempt to insulate his family from his violence. He does not experience this as a tragic violation, but as a humiliating breach of his absolute authority and intellect. His immediate reaction is not to comfort his terrified wife, but to instantly assess the tactical failure of his guards. He realizes with chilling clarity that the threat was orchestrated from within, triggering a level of paranoia that borders on clinical psychosis. He immediately isolates himself from his family, weaponizing his martyr complex to justify his impending brutality. He hands temporary control to Tom Hagen with explicit instructions that exclude his own bloodline, confirming his total distrust of his kin. He convinces himself that his emotional detachment is the only mechanism capable of preserving the syndicate. He is actively choosing the role of a dead man walking, existing only to execute a flawlessly calibrated revenge. The emotional starvation of his environment is no longer a side effect. It is his primary conscious defensive strategy. His treatment of Tom Hagen during this crisis exposes his manipulative mastery over those who seek his approval. He actively dangles the prospect of total exclusion to keep Hagen off balance and entirely dependent. He does not offer Hagen genuine partnership. He merely leverages Hagen's innate decency and legal acumen for his own survival. He treats his adopted brother's loyalty as a renewable resource to be exploited without reciprocation. This psychological subjugation ensures that Hagen remains compliant, terrified of losing a familial connection that has already been hollowed out. Hyman Roth is the psychological mirror he absolutely refuses to acknowledge. Roth represents the absolute zenith of the corporate underworld he aspires to build. Quiet, immensely wealthy, and devoid of street-level theatrics. Their interactions are masterclasses in mutual deception, two apex predators hiding lethal intentions behind polite geriatric dialogue. He studies Roth's methodology obsessively, absorbing the older man's ability to monetize systemic corruption on an international scale. Yet he fundamentally underestimates Roth's ruthlessness, projecting his own strategic arrogance onto a far more experienced adversary. The excursion to Havana is his most ambitious attempt to legitimize his empire through international corporate sovereignty. He walks through the Cuban presidential palace not as a gangster, but as an equal partner to sovereign nations and telecommunications monopolies. However, his geopolitical awareness is uniquely acute. He observes the societal rot beneath the dictatorship before the legitimate businessmen do. He correctly calculates that a government failing to inspire fear in a suicidal rebel is a compromised terminal asset. His insight is profound, but it is driven entirely by cold risk assessment rather than any ideological empathy for the oppressed. Fredo's arrival in Havana introduces a fatal structural weakness into his carefully orchestrated international chess match. He utilizes his older brother strictly as a courier, constantly exposing his profound lack of respect for Fredo's capabilities. When the truth of Fredo's betrayal is inadvertently revealed during the Superman Club sequence, his internal architecture violently shatters. The realization that his own blood conspired with Hyman Roth is a psychological wound that entirely defies his capacity for rationalization. He processes the treason not with explosive rage, but with a terrifying frozen silence that signals an impending absolute zero. The New Year's Eve confrontation with Fredo is utterly devoid of brotherly connection. It is a clinical autopsy of their relationship. The physical kiss he forces upon Fredo is a perverse, terrifying subversion of familial affection. It is a territorial branding, a definitive declaration of ownership, and an inescapable biological death sentence. He does not seek an explanation or offer a path to redemption, because in his rigid operational doctrine, betrayal is an irreversible contagion. He leaves Fredo to suffocate in his own terror, a calculated psychological torture that precedes physical elimination. The chaotic collapse of the Cuban regime forces a humiliating, desperate retreat from his global ambitions. He loses his capital investment, his international legitimacy, and the illusion of his family's impenetrable unity in a single night. The frantic escape represents the violent rejection of his corporate aspirations by the uncontrollable forces of history. He returns to the United States geographically intact but structurally devastated. The empire is financially bleeding, and the internal rot has finally breached the core of his command structure. The congressional hearings represent the ultimate collision between his underworld reality and his desperate, legitimate aspirations. He sits before the Senate committee utilizing the exact same stoic facade he employs against rival syndicates. He recognizes the committee not as a moral authority, but as a rival gang utilizing legislative theater to extract political capital. His testimony is a masterpiece of perjury, delivered with the chilling conviction of a man who believes he is fundamentally above all human jurisdiction. He effectively weaponizes the American legal system's reliance on empirical evidence, knowing his structural distance from the violence protects him. When faced with the existential threat of Frank Pentangeli's testimony, he bypasses standard violence to orchestrate a breathtaking psychological checkmate. By silently placing Pentangeli's brother in the congressional chamber, he weaponizes familial shame and the ancient code of omerta to force a retraction. Observing the collapse of the government's star witness with dead-eyed satisfaction, he successfully utilizes the archaic traditions he outwardly despises to protect his modern corporate empire. It is a profound cultural extortion, exploiting the very heritage he sought to permanently escape. He actively seeks validation for his emotional necrosis through a chilling conversation with his aging mother, Carmela. He asks her if a man can lose his family, a desperate attempt to find a historical acceptable precedent for his total isolation. He is searching for permission to completely abandon his humanity under the guise of familial duty. Her response, rooted in an old-world understanding of unbreakable loyalty, offers him zero psychological comfort. He realizes that even the matriarch of his bloodline cannot comprehend the sterile, terrifying wasteland he has constructed. During this period of intense external warfare, the domestic environment becomes a suffocating psychological prison for his wife. Kay observes his legal maneuvering and understands with terrifying clarity that the promised legitimacy was always a manipulative, indefinite fiction. She is entirely trapped behind the compound's walls, a hostage to his paranoid security protocols and absolute patriarchal control. The cognitive dissonance she maintained to survive the marriage violently shatters. She realizes she is not married to a troubled businessman, but to a remorseless architect of human suffering. Kay's unilateral decision to end her pregnancy is the most devastating assault on his power structure imaginable. It is an act of profound, desperate rebellion against his absolute control over her reality. When she confesses the true nature of her procedure, it strikes directly at the core of his fragile Sicilian machismo. The unborn child was his intended legacy, the theoretical, untainted heir to his sanitized empire. Her action is a complete rejection of his bloodline, a definitive statement that his genetic continuation is a moral catastrophe. His reaction to Kay's confession is a complete, terrifying loss of his tightly controlled clinical composure. The physical strike across her face is the sudden, violent rupture of his carefully curated, stoic facade. He cannot manipulate, bribe, or intimidate his way out of this highly specific, intimate humiliation. The violence is a pathetic, impotent response from a man who realizes he has absolutely no emotional control over his environment. The physical blow destroys the final remnants of their partnership, reducing their marriage to a hostile, irreconcilable captivity. He immediately exiles Kay from his physical presence, severing her access to their remaining children with bureaucratic efficiency. This act of cruel separation is framed as a punishment, but it is fundamentally an act of cowardice and self-preservation. He cannot endure the constant living reminder of his own moral bankruptcy that she perfectly represents. He relies entirely on his structural power to enforce his will, utilizing his wealth to legally erase her maternal rights. He has successfully secured his empire from the United States government, but his home is completely, irreversibly barren. He emerges from the Senate hearings legally victorious but psychologically decimated. He wanders the expansive, silent halls of his Lake Tahoe estate, an apex predator confined within a self-imposed, luxurious captivity. The collateral damage of his reign is no longer measured in rival casualties, but in the complete destruction of his own family unit. The silence of the estate is absolute, broken only by the synchronized patrols of his armed security detail. He has engineered an environment completely devoid of organic human friction, a sovereign presiding over a heavily fortified mausoleum. He obsessively reviews the operational ledgers, substituting financial metrics for authentic human connection. The staggering wealth of the syndicate provides no emotional sustenance. It is merely a numerical validation of his absolute dominance. He evaluates every remaining associate through a deeply paranoid matrix of potential betrayal, Loyalty is no longer a concept he recognizes or trusts. He only acknowledges the temporary alignment of mutual interests. The sovereign is utterly alone, managing a blood-soaked balance sheet rather than leading a family. Carmela Corleone's existence serves as the final agonizing stay of execution for his older brother. Her physical presence represents the last microscopic thread of traditional Sicilian morality he is willing to observe. Fredo's temporary reprieve is born neither of lingering fraternal love nor sudden mercy. The delay is calculated strictly to avoid fracturing the matriarch's deeply ingrained illusion of family unity. This calculated delay is an exercise in profound psychological torture for the exiled brother. The mother's funeral is completely devoid of authentic grief. It functions strictly as a tactical transition point. Connie's desperate attempt to engineer a public reconciliation between the brothers is deeply pathetic and entirely useless. He accepts Fredo's weeping embrace with a terrifying absolute physical rigidity. This is not a gesture of forgiveness. It is the final physical confirmation of a high-value target. He utilizes his sister's emotional desperation to draw the victim directly into the operational strike zone. The directive given to his enforcer, Al Neri, is communicated through a silent, dead-eyed stare across the Tahoe compound. He no longer requires spoken language to authorize the permanent destruction of his own bloodline. The structural hierarchy of his syndicate is so perfectly calibrated to his paranoia that a mere glance constitutes an irreversible death warrant. He outsources the violence, maintaining his physical distance from the biological reality of his decision. He remains entirely detached from the visceral horror of fratricide, viewing it purely as an administrative necessity. Fredo's final moments on the fishing boat are a pathetic, agonizing culmination of a life defined by inadequacy. The older brother is praying, clinging to the naive hope that he has been genuinely reintegrated into the family structure. The fatal echo rolling across the water is the definitive sound of the family's absolute moral annihilation. There is no defensive rationalization available for this specific act of violence. It is a profoundly evil execution, rooted entirely in a fragile male ego demanding ultimate vengeance. He observes the execution from the distant boathouse, physically insulated but psychologically destroyed. He bows his head not in prayer or genuine mourning, but in a crushing, silent acknowledgement of his own damnation. He has successfully eliminated the final internal threat to his corporate structure. Yet, in doing so, he has permanently severed his own soul from the human condition. The cognitive dissonance fractures entirely. He knows exactly what he has become. The immediate aftermath of the lake execution ushers in a terrifying era of total existential isolation. The Lake Tahoe compound transitions from a fortified headquarters into a heavily guarded tomb. He sits alone in the autumnal gloom, accompanied only by the ghosts of the men he systematically eliminated. His paranoia is no longer a temporary defense mechanism. It is the only psychological state he can access. He has permanently secured the empire, but the man wearing the crown is completely hollowed out. Decades pass, and the severe physical toll of his psychological rot manifests in devastating diabetic strokes, the visceral rebellion of a body collapsing under the weight of internalized atrocities. He physically deteriorates while launching his final agonizing attempt at corporate absolution, the pursuit of the Vatican's immobiliar conglomerate. Approaching the Catholic Church not with spiritual humility, but as a corporate raider seeking a divine merger, he applies his underworld logic to the highest echelons of spiritual authority. His profound hubris convinces him that even God's grace has a negotiable terrestrial price tag, attempting to literally buy his way into heaven using blood money. Archbishop Gilday represents the ultimate hypocrisy of the legitimate institutional world he reveres. The Church willingly accepts his illicit capital, implicitly validating his ruthless accumulation of power. This transaction temporarily reinforces his lifelong self-deception, allowing him to masquerade as a philanthropic titan. He surrounds himself with clergy and politicians, successfully purchasing the optical illusion of extreme respectability. Yet the transactional nature of this absolution leaves his internal suffocating guilt completely untouched. His adult children represent the catastrophic failure of his generational ambitions. His son Anthony's absolute refusal to integrate into the family structure is a profound, humiliating rejection of his father's sacrifices. He observes his son choosing the precarious life of an opera singer over the multi-billion-dollar empire he brutally constructed. This rejection is an agonizing realization that his life's work is viewed by his own blood as a toxic inheritance. He cannot control his son with fear, rendering his primary tool of dominance entirely useless. Mary Corleone serves as the tragic, unwitting repository of his remaining fractured humanity. He projects all his desperate desires for purity and legitimacy onto her, utilizing her as the public face of his philanthropic foundation. She is dangerously naive, insulated by his wealth, and completely ignorant of the systemic violence that funded her existence. His obsessive need to protect her from his reality is driven by a terrifying subconscious awareness of his own karmic debt. He knows that his enemies view his deep affection for her as a catastrophic tactical vulnerability. His relationship with his adult ex-wife is a masochistic exercise in unresolved generational trauma. He seeks her out in Sicily, attempting to rewrite their history and extract a microscopic shred of forgiveness. He utilizes a calculated vulnerability, intentionally lowering his defenses to manipulate her lingering emotional attachment. He desperately wants her to validate his lifelong rationalization that his monstrous actions were an inescapable tragedy forced upon him by circumstance. He cannot accept that his moral decay was a series of conscious, egotistical choices. As his physical and operational energy fails, he increasingly delegates the visceral territorial combat to willing proxies. He utilizes his sister Connie, now a dark, enabling reflection of his own ruthlessness, and his illegitimate nephew Vincent, who embodies the exact hot-blooded aggression he spent his life trying to suppress. This reliance exposes the undeniable reality that he has never truly escaped his street-level origins. He views his new enforcers with a mixture of tactical necessity and internalized disgust, utilizing them to maintain a facade of aristocratic retirement while feeding a deeply pathological addiction to absolute control. The realization that the Vatican apparatus is actively conspiring against him triggers a devastating collapse of his worldview. The highest legitimate authority on earth is revealed to be as ruthlessly corrupt as the street gangs he eliminated in his youth. The immobiliare betrayal destroys his lifelong sustaining illusion that a sanitized moral zenith actually exists. He is forced to acknowledge that the legitimate world is simply another highly decorated theater of war. His entire foundational philosophy, the desperate drive toward legality, is exposed as a naive, pathetic fallacy. The physical collapse in the Italian courtyard following this realization is a profound psychological surrender. The severe diabetic shock is triggered not just by physical illness, but by the crushing weight of absolute systemic betrayal. He screams for his deceased brother in his delirium, the deeply repressed guilt finally breaching his impenetrable stoic defenses. The cognitive dissonance has completely evaporated, leaving him entirely exposed to the unvarnished horror of his fratricide. He is a multi-billionaire surrounded by enemies, utterly defenseless against his own agonizing memories. The subsequent confession to Cardinal Lamberto is the most agonizing vulnerability he ever displays. He does not seek a tactical advantage. He is physically and spiritually breaking down under the vast accumulation of his sins. When he confesses to ordering the demise of his brother, he visibly shudders, physically sickened by the verbal admission. He acknowledges that he is beyond traditional redemption, recognizing the absolute permanence of his moral destruction. It is a rare moment of terrifying clarity where the sovereign finally admits he is an irredeemable monster. Lamberto's absolution offers a fleeting, microscopic moment of psychological relief, but it cannot alter the trajectory of his karmic debt. The confession cleanses his soul in the eyes of the church, but it provides zero protection from the violent ecosystem he engineered. He returns to the operational theater with a heavy, fatalistic resignation. He recognizes that he is permanently trapped in the life he built, forced to continue playing a lethal game he no longer wishes to win. The machinery of his syndicate demands his continuous, ruthless participation until his final breath. The transition of power to Vincent Mancini is not an act of familial love or strategic brilliance. It is an agonizing admission of ultimate defeat. He spent his entire adult life desperately attempting to scrub the violent street-level grit from the Corleone name, aiming for sterile corporate legitimacy. Yet, when his empire is existentially threatened by the Immobiliare conspiracy, the boardroom tactics completely fail him. He is forced to acknowledge that the only viable defense mechanism is the exact unhinged brutality he spent decades trying to eradicate. Vincent is the physical embodiment of that primitive violence, a walking manifestation of the family's darkest, most regressive DNA. Mentoring the illegitimate nephew exposes the staggering depths of his cognitive dissonance and structural hypocrisy. He constantly lectures the young man on the necessity of calculated, emotionless strategy, demanding a clinical detachment from the violence. However, he is fully aware that Vincent's effectiveness relies entirely on his explosive, unregulated rage and territorial machismo. He is actively weaponizing the very psychological instability he previously condemned in his brother Sonny, utilizing it as a blunt instrument of survival. He demands the optical illusion of sophistication from a man he intends to use purely as an attack dog. The condition he sets for Vincent's ascension, the termination of the romantic relationship with Mary Corleone, is a masterstroke of toxic, patriarchal control. He frames this demand as an act of absolute protection, insisting that the syndicate's reality will ultimately destroy her innocence. In reality, it is a desperate, hypocritical attempt to enforce a moral boundary he obliterated within his own life decades ago. He is demanding that Vincent sacrifice his humanity for the crown, exactly as he did, ensuring the cycle of emotional starvation continues. The young man's immediate, cold compliance terrifies him, providing a chilling mirror to his own past ruthless ambitions. His return to Sicily for his son's operatic debut is a geographical regression to the origin point of his moral decay. The sun-drenched landscape is heavily saturated with the ghosts of his initial transformation, a permanent reminder of the collateral damage he initiated. He walks through the ancient villages not as a returning sovereign, but as a heavily guarded prisoner of his own historical narrative. The rustic environment sharply contrasts with his fading physical form, emphasizing the unnatural manufactured nature of his existence. He is a corporate titan completely alienated from the ancestral soil he claims to revere. The assassination of Don Tommasino severs his final tenuous link to an idealized, romanticized version of the Sicilian underworld. Tommasino represented a code of honor and community integration that his own corporate syndicate completely abandoned in favor of absolute tyranny. He observes the old Don's demise not merely as a tactical loss, but as the violent erasure of a historical fantasy. Standing over the casket, he explicitly asks why he was so universally feared, while the deceased was universally loved. It is a pathetic, deeply unself-aware question from an architect who systematically utilized terror as his primary management tool. He demands a tactical cessation of hostilities, screaming for an end to the generational bloodshed he spent his entire life orchestrating. This plea for peace is entirely performative, an impotent cry from a man who realizes he has entirely lost control of the machinery. The ecosystem of violence he meticulously engineered no longer requires his direct authorization to function. It has become self-sustaining and omnivorous. He cannot simply declare a truce because the architectural foundation of his empire is built exclusively on preemptive elimination. The sovereign is finally being crushed by the immense gravitational pull of his own structural design. The physical deterioration of his body accelerates in direct correlation to the collapse of his psychological defenses. The debilitating diabetic tremors and sudden physical collapses are visceral, biological protests against a lifetime of suppressed empathy and normalized atrocity. His body is rejecting the cognitive dissonance, breaking down the chemical barriers that allowed him to rationalize the elimination of his kin. The physical agony is merely a prelude to the existential dread that now entirely occupies his waking hours. He is rotting from the inside out, a delayed, agonizing biological toll for the spiritual necrosis he embraced. His interactions with his ex-wife during the Sicilian exile reveal a desperate, manipulative attempt to rewrite his historical ledger. He takes her on a curated tour of his ancestral village, utilizing nostalgia as a weapon to soften her legitimate, ingrained hostility. He wants her to view him not as the ruthless orchestrator of their family's destruction, but as a tragic, misunderstood victim of circumstance. He is essentially lobbying for a posthumous pardon from the only woman who accurately witnessed the entirety of his moral descent. It is the final, pathetic exertion of a fragile male ego, demanding validation even as the empire crumbles. The operatic production of Cavalleria Rusticana serves as the perfect, suffocating backdrop for his impending psychological annihilation. The theatrical presentation of Sicilian betrayal and honor killings perfectly mirrors the actual bloody reality occurring behind the velvet curtains. He sits in the royal box, physically elevated above the audience, yet entirely trapped within the crosshairs of multiple intersecting conspiracies. The artificial drama on the stage is a grotesque synchronized accompaniment to the real-world eliminations being executed under his implicit authority. He is a spectator to the final act of his own orchestrated tragedy, entirely powerless to alter the choreography. Even as he projects his desperate need for a legitimate legacy onto his son's operatic triumph, his enjoyment is fundamentally compromised by hypervigilant paranoia. He cannot consume the art without filtering it through a matrix of tactical risk assessment. Simultaneously, the orchestrated eliminations carried out by his proxies mirror the baptism sequence of his youth. However, he is no longer the precise architect of this violence. He is merely an exhausted, passive beneficiary. By allowing the new generation to unleash the exact tactical savagery he once claimed to despise, he proves his lifelong pursuit of legitimacy was entirely fraudulent. He watches the final curtain fall with a profound, heavy exhaustion. The immediate tactical threats have been eliminated, yet the victory is entirely hollow. He has successfully secured the throne only to recognize with terrifying clarity that his kingdom is nothing but a heavily armed graveyard. Exiting the theater in a tight, protective formation, he believes he has finally navigated the ultimate labyrinth. He is entirely unprepared for the reality that karmic retribution operates completely outside the parameters of his tactical control. The descent of the Teatro Massimo stairs is the precise geographical location where his lifelong cognitive dissonance violently detonates. He believes the violence is concluded, walking into the Sicilian night, enveloped by his surviving bloodline. The assassin's bullet, intended for the sovereign, bypasses its intended target to strike the purest asset of the empire. This is the ultimate catastrophic failure of his entire operational doctrine. He spent his life orchestrating preemptive strikes to build a fortress, only to realize the fortress itself was the magnet for the artillery. The immediate physical reaction to Mary's collapse is a profound study in psychological, systemic failure. He does not instantly register the reality of the biological damage. His brain, wired for decades to process tactical threats, momentarily misfires when confronted with unmitigated, intimate collateral damage. The devastation is no longer metaphorical or conveniently outsourced to street-level enforcers. It is the immediate, visceral reality of his own genetic line being irreversibly severed. The infamous silent scream is not merely an expression of paternal grief. It is the agonizing sound of an existential collapse. The audio drops out because his internal reality has entirely divorced from the physical world. He is experiencing the instantaneous incineration of his lifelong rationalization. Every execution, every lie, every betrayal was theoretically justified by the absolute mandate to protect his family. With her demise, the entire mathematical equation of his life equates to absolute zero. He fundamentally differs from the purely sociopathic entities he eliminated throughout his reign. A true psychopath, like the men he warred against, views collateral damage strictly as an operational inconvenience. He is profoundly, agonizingly human, cursed with a functioning conscience that he spent a lifetime burying under corporate rationale. This residual humanity is not his salvation. It is the specific instrument of his ultimate torture. He is fully capable of understanding the precise magnitude of the horror he engineered. The karmic loop closes with a devastating symmetrical precision on those stone steps. His initial entry into the underworld was triggered by violence against his father, an act he countered to preserve the family. The culmination of his reign is the destruction of his daughter, the innocent consequence of the violent ecosystem he chose to perpetuate. He attempted to master the machinery of death, entirely blind to its insatiable, indiscriminate appetite. The blood debt he incurred decades prior is finally, mercilessly collected. His ex-wife Kay's reaction over the body is the final judgment upon his soul. She does not look at the assassin, she looks directly at him, her eyes confirming the horrifying truth they both instantly recognize. He is the true author of this violence, the architect who built the stage upon which his daughter was sacrificed. Her wails are a devastating chorus condemning his profound hubris and toxic masculinity. He has completely validated every accusation she ever leveled against his manufactured legitimacy. The sudden rush of memories flashing through his mind at the moment of her passing is a psychological inventory of his collateral damage. He envisions the women he utilized, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed through his proximity. Apollonia, Kay, and Mary represent the three distinct phases of his moral decay. Each woman offered a pathway to genuine humanity, and he systemically neutralized each one through his paranoid obsession with control. They are the tragic milestones of his descent into absolute darkness. The empire he secured becomes instantly irrelevant the moment the breath leaves his daughter's body. The multi-billion-dollar Vatican holdings, the global casino operations, and the political leverage evaporate into meaningless operational noise. He recognizes that he traded the souls of his family for a crown forged entirely of ash. His lifelong pursuit of absolute power was a fundamentally flawed defense mechanism that successfully eliminated his enemies while simultaneously executing his loved ones. The sovereign is utterly irreversibly bankrupt. His descent forces a reevaluation of the classic anti-hero archetype. He does not revel in his malevolence like a traditional cinematic villain, nor does he possess the gleeful sadism of his underworld peers. His cruelty is distinctly bureaucratic, administered with the detached efficiency of a corporate restructuring. This makes him profoundly more terrifying than a chaotic sociopath. He represents the banality of evil, a man who normalizes atrocities by burying them under layers of administrative necessity and familial obligation. The concept of a karmic ledger is central to his psychological unraveling. He spent his youth believing his intellect could outmaneuver the spiritual consequences of his actions. He viewed morality as a fluid construct, applicable to civilians, but temporarily suspended for sovereigns engaged in defensive warfare. He discovers with agonizing finality that the moral universe does not recognize his corporate exemptions. The debt accrues entirely independent of his sophisticated rationalizations, demanding a catastrophic repayment. His ultimate failure is rooted in a fundamental misdiagnosis of his own trauma. He dedicated his existence to fortifying the perimeter against external threats, completely blind to the reality that the rot was emanating from his own psyche. The tragedy is absolute. The man who appointed himself the protector of the bloodline became its most lethal predator. He represents the ultimate failure of the patriarchal ideal. The traditional masculine mandate to provide and protect at all costs is taken to its most extreme pathological conclusion. He strips away all emotional intelligence, nurturing, and vulnerability, leaving only the cold mechanics of security. He provides immense wealth and physical safety, but creates an environment so toxic that his kin cannot biologically or psychologically survive it. He achieves absolute structural success and total human failure. With his family structure completely annihilated, Michael enters a permanent, self-imposed exile. He is banished not by federal authorities or rival syndicates, but by the irreversible consequences of his own actions. His final days in the Sicilian courtyard represent a complete loss of operational power. Stripped of his corporate armor and the intimidating authority of the Don, he is reduced to an aging, isolated figure, simply waiting for biological expiration. In his prime, he utilized silence as an interrogative weapon to intimidate subordinates. Now that same silence is weaponized against him by the universe itself. The absence of dialogue underscores the complete erosion of his structural authority. With no orders left to give and no operational crises to manage, the mind that once calculated the destruction of 5 rival families becomes a useless, agonizing prison. He is entirely abandoned to the devastating company of his own flawless memory. The donning of the dark sunglasses is a pathetic, habitual attempt to maintain a microscopic barrier against the world. Even in total isolation, he instinctively attempts to conceal the emptiness of his gaze. It is a lingering symptom of his lifelong paranoia, a deeply ingrained reflex to hide his vulnerability. However, there are no enemies left to deceive, no rivals studying his facial expressions for weakness. The armor is functionally useless, serving only to obscure his vision of the desolate reality he created. The presence of the stray dog is a brutal, unspoken commentary on his final societal standing. He spent decades demanding absolute loyalty from armies of men, enforcing respect through terror and immense financial leverage. In his final hours, his only companion is an animal devoid of any understanding of his historical power or wealth. The dog is not loyal to the sovereign. It is merely lingering near a decaying biological entity. He dies, entirely stripped of the artificial reverence he spent his life violently extracting from humanity. His physical passing is remarkably unremarkable, entirely devoid of the cinematic grandeur that defined his violent reign. He simply slides out of his chair, collapsing onto the dusty earth with a pathetic, hollow thud. This quiet expiration is the absolute zenith of his existential punishment. A violent demise in the streets would have validated his paranoid worldview, granting him a soldier's death. Instead, the universe denies him martyrdom, forcing the man who orchestrated America's most sophisticated criminal syndicate to die alone, exactly like a forgotten peasant. The orange dropping from his hand is the final symbolic severing of the Corleone legacy. The fruit, historically tethered to the violence of his bloodline, falls entirely unheeded into the dirt. There is no heir waiting to retrieve it, no loyal lieutenant to catch the symbol of power before it hits the ground. His lifelong obsession with securing the family's future results in the absolute termination of its significance. The empire is inherited by cold corporate proxies. Completely detached from the bloodline, he sacrificed his soul to protect. He failed the foundational mandate established by his father. Vito Corleone built an empire to ensure his family would never be manipulated by the powerful men of the world. He weaponized that empire, transforming himself into the exact monster his father warned against, only to annihilate the family from the inside out. He conflated the survival of the business structure with the survival of the bloodline. The tragic irony is that he successfully legitimized the corporation by systematically executing the family. The legacy of Michael Corleone is not a triumph of strategic brilliance, but a terrifying blueprint of psychological necrosis. He is the ultimate cautionary tale of the American dream, metastasizing into a nightmare of toxic masculinity and unbridled hubris. He believed he could navigate the abyss without absorbing its darkness, relying on a fragile intellectual superiority. Instead, the abyss consumed him entirely, utilizing his own desperate need for control as the mechanism of his destruction. He became the architect of his own absolute damnation. His physical death simply formalizes a psychological destruction that occurred decades prior. There is no familial mourning or monument to his strategic intellect. He finally achieved the absolute security he pursued his entire life. He is perfectly safe because there is absolutely nothing left to protect. The operational doctrine designed to preserve his empire ultimately eradicated his bloodline. The architect of the Corleone syndicate simply expires alone, trapped in the permanent silence he meticulously constructed.